There is a doorway in a farmhouse in rural Burgundy, France, that has stood since 1423. It is 4 feet 11 inches tall. The family that built it was not unusually short. They were average for their time. When historians first documented this structure in 1971, they assumed it was a storage outbuilding because no normal adult could enter without ducking. It is a bedroom. It was where people slept for 400 years. This is not a curiosity. It is evidence. Evidence of something the standard economic histories of the Western world have spent 2 centuries quietly papering over. The ceilings in old buildings were not made for people our size because people were not our size. And the story of why they weren't when they changed and what drove that change is not the story you were taught. It is a story about food, power, land, and the deliberate engineering of scarcity that altered the human body itself. Let's start with what we actually know. The average height of a Western European male in the year 1000 AD was approximately 5 feet 8 inches. This surprises most people because the popular image of medieval people is of small, hunched, malnourished figures. That image is wrong, and we can prove it wrong from the skeletons. Bioarchaeologists have measured thousands of remains from this period across England, France, Germany, and Scandinavia. The numbers cluster consistently. Men in the Viking Age were not short. Women averaged 5 feet 2 to 5 feet 4. These were people who, if dressed in modern clothing and placed on a modern street, would not look unusual. Then something happened. By 1400, average male height in Western Europe had dropped to approximately 5 feet 5 inches. By 1600, it had fallen further to roughly 5 feet 4. The low point came in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when industrializing European populations reached average male heights of 5 feet 3 inches in some regions of England. This was not a gradual drift. It was a collapse, spread across 5 centuries, and it was not distributed evenly across the population. The poor shrank, the wealthy stayed tall or grew taller. The gap between the heights of aristocrats and labourers became so pronounced by the 16th century that contemporaries commented on it in writing, assuming it was simply the natural order that noble blood produced larger bodies. It was not noble blood, it was protein. The mechanism here is not complicated, but the implications are. Human height is largely determined in the first 3 years of life. The critical inputs are calories, protein, and absence of chronic infection. A child who receives adequate nutrition during this window reaches their genetic height potential. A child who does not will be permanently shorter, regardless of what they eat afterward. This is not reversible. The stunting is written into the bones. What changed between the year 1000 and the year 1600 was access to those inputs specifically for the labouring majority of the population. And what changed access was not technology, not plague, not some inevitable march of agricultural decline. What changed access was land tenure. In the early medieval period, common land was a functional reality across most of Western Europe. Peasant families had grazing rights, foraging rights, fishing rights. They kept pigs, chickens, the occasional cow. They supplemented grain with animal protein in ways that, by the skeletal evidence, maintained adequate nutrition. This was not prosperity. It was subsistence, but it was nutritionally sufficient subsistence. The bones show it. The enclosure of common land began in England in the 13th century and accelerated through the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries. The process was not uniform, but the direction was consistent. Land that had supported multiple uses by multiple families was converted to single-purpose agriculture or grazing, controlled by a single owner, worked by labourers who now received wages instead of access. The pigs disappeared. The chickens became market goods. The protein that had kept the skeletal record intact began to vanish from the labouring diet. It is worth being precise about what the commons actually were, because the word has been flattened in modern usage into something vague and slightly romantic. The commons were not charity. They were not gifts from lords to peasants. They were legal rights, attached to specific plots of land, held by specific families, enforceable in court. A family with common rights to the village green could graze a defined number of animals there. A family with estovers had the legal right to cut wood for fuel and fencing. A family with piscary rights could fish designated waters. These were property rights in the full legal sense, and the families who held them had held them in many cases for generations before anyone thought to write them down. Enclosure was the legal extinguishment of those rights. Parliament in England passed over 4,000 individual enclosure acts between 1700 and 1900 alone. Each one was specific to a place, a parish, a set of fields. Each one transferred rights from the many to the few, almost always with compensation structured in ways that favoured landowners and left former commoners with parcels too small to be viable, or with cash payments that were consumed within a generation. The legal machinery was so successful that by 1850, common land in England had been reduced to roughly 3% of what it had been in 1500. The German, French and Scandinavian experiences varied in their timing and their mechanisms, but the trajectory was the same. In France, the process was accelerated by the Revolution, which abolished feudal rights but also, in practice, accelerated the privatization of land that had previously been held communally. In Prussia, reforms that were explicitly designed to modernize agriculture had the same structural effect. Different politics, different rhetoric, same outcome. The commons contracted. The protein contracted with them. Historians of the enclosure movement have documented its effects on wages, on rural migration, on the growth of urban poverty. They have written extensively about the social dislocation it caused. What they have written almost nothing about is what it did to the human body, because that required connecting two separate academic disciplines, economic history and bioarchaeology, that spent most of the 20th century not reading each other. The connection was made slowly through researchers who were interested in exactly the kind of question that makes academic departments uncomfortable. Not what happened, but what was done, and to whom, and whether the people who did it knew what they were doing. One of the foundational papers in this field was published by economist Richard Steckel in 1995. Steckel had spent years compiling skeletal data from burial sites across North America and Europe, tracking height across centuries. What he found contradicted the dominant narrative of economic history so directly that the initial reception was skeptical. The narrative said that living standards had risen more or less continuously since the medieval period, that industrialization had lifted all boats, that modernity was an improvement over what came before. The skeletons said something different. They said the bodies of working people had gotten smaller as the economies around them got larger. They said the transition to industrial capitalism had for at least 2 centuries made the bodies of the poor worse. Steckel and the researchers who followed him did not argue that industrialization was a mistake. They argued that its costs had been borne very unevenly, written into bones and doorframes, and the physical record of a civilization that was growing taller at the top while shrinking at the bottom. Here is what the record shows. In regions where enclosure was most aggressive and most complete, the height decline was steepest. In regions where common land persisted longer, where peasant access to animal husbandry survived, the decline was shallower. This is not a perfect correlation. Disease, warfare, climate, all of these play roles. But the pattern is consistent enough that researchers working independently in England, in France, and in Scandinavia have converged on the same conclusion. The bodies got smaller when the food got worse. The food got worse when the land got enclosed. Now, consider what this means for the buildings. The doorways in English farmhouses built before 1400 are, on average, taller than the doorways in farmhouses built between 1600 and 1800. This seems counterintuitive because we associate later construction with greater sophistication, better resources, more advanced technique. But the people who built those later farmhouses were building for themselves and their families. And by 1700, labouring families in England were several inches shorter on average than their ancestors had been 3 centuries earlier. They were not building shorter doors because they had less skill. They were building shorter doors because they were shorter. The ceilings follow the same logic. Low ceilings in older peasant structures are not primitive. They are calibrated. They reflect the body sizes of the people who lived in them. And when you compare structures built by labouring families in the 17th and 18th centuries to structures built by similar families in the 12th and 13th centuries, the calibration has shifted downward. The rooms got smaller because the people got smaller. The people got smaller because they got poorer. They got poorer because the common resources that had sustained their nutrition were taken. There is an objection here that gets raised immediately, and it is worth taking seriously. The objection is that correlation is not causation, that height varies for many reasons, that the enclosure narrative oversimplifies a complex historical process. All of this is true, and the researchers making these arguments are not claiming a single cause. They are claiming that land access was a major driver of nutritional status, that nutritional status was a major driver of height, and that this connection has been underemphasized in the standard economic histories, because those histories were written almost exclusively by people who were themselves descended from the classes that benefited from enclosure. That last point is not a conspiracy theory, it is a structural observation about who produces historical knowledge. The great economic historians of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the men who established the canonical narratives of agricultural development and industrialization, worked at institutions funded and populated by families whose wealth originated in exactly the period under question. They were not lying, they were selecting, emphasizing the productivity gains of enclosure, the efficiency improvements, the foundations for industrial capitalism. Not emphasizing the bodies, the bones were there, the data was available, it simply was not the story being told. The reversal in height trends is itself instructive. European and American heights began rising again in the late 19th century and rose sharply through the 20th. The standard explanation credits rising wages and industrialization. This is partially correct, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. The specific inputs that drove height recovery were protein consumption, childhood disease reduction, and the expansion of what might loosely be called commons in their modern form, public sanitation systems, public health infrastructure, and eventually food welfare programs that restored, through state intervention, the baseline nutritional access that had been lost when the original commons were taken. In other words, the solution to the problem created by enclosure was, at its core, a partial re-enclosure in reverse. Not common land, but common infrastructure. The state replacing, imperfectly and incompletely, what communities had once held together. The average height of a Western European male today is approximately 5 feet 10 inches. This is close to, and in some Northern European populations slightly exceeds, the heights recorded in the early medieval skeletal record. We have, after 6 centuries of decline and a century of recovery, returned roughly to where we started. But the buildings we built during the centuries of decline are still standing. They are in the historical record. They are in the tourism brochures photographed as charming relics of a simpler time. The low doorways and the cramped rooms and the narrow staircases are described as quaint, as atmospheric, as characteristic of the period. They are not charming. They are a record of what was done to the people who lived in them. Each doorway is a measurement. Each ceiling is a data point. The buildings are a graph, and the graph shows a decline that lasted 500 years, tracked precisely in limestone and oak, and the compressed spines of people who were poorer and smaller than their great-grandparents had been, and who built their houses to fit the bodies they had. Beethoven's tuning fork sits in a glass case in the British Library. The doorway in the Burgundy farmhouse is still there, still 4 feet 11 inches tall. Both of them hold frequencies the modern world has stopped reading correctly. Both of them are telling you something if you are willing to look at what they actually are. The ceilings were not made for people our size, they were made for the people who were there. And the question worth asking is not why those people were so small. The question worth asking is what was taken from them that made them that way.